Okay, hello friends, and welcome back to another exciting Chabura Public Shiur. We are back with Chacham Berdugo. We're going to be exploring the sources of our Berakhot, who instituted them, which ones are instituted, and this was a very much requested, and there's a lot of excitement around this topic. It actually blew up on all of our discussion boards, so we're all very excited for this. Just wanted to let everyone know that on top of the public shooting that we put out, the Chabura has a membership model. So I highly recommend everyone checking that out and becoming a member and taking advantage of all our shiurim that we have. We have 2 a week, we have live events, we have journal, publishing house. So I highly recommend everyone join that and also become a member and join our discussion groups and our discords. So with that, we're very excited to have you back, Chacham, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to hear it's an exciting topic and that you guys have been talking about it. For me, I've always been fascinated by this topic. There's always much debate amongst the poskim about the different Berakhot. We're not going to talk about the reason why Hachamim enacted the Berakhot. I'm sure everybody's familiar with that. Birkat Hamazon is probably the only concept from the Torah, the Oraita. There are some who want to say it's also Birkat Torah as well, and perhaps also from the Shiva Minim. However, simply everybody agrees for sure that Birkat Hamazon, the concept of blessing after you eat, ve'achalta v'savata, is from the Torah, but every other type of beracha is a rabbinic enactment. And of course, simply the reason behind this enactment is to always connect us on a very high level. It's just connect us constantly with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, bring him into our lives. As Jews that follow rabbinic law, it's probably one of the most encompassing halachot, almost everything you do, because most of the time we're eating or we're sleeping. Everything you do, there's a beracha before and after. So it really is a very important topic to really know the history behind it, the source behind it, and like Ohad said, who has the authority and power to make these berachot? And on top of it, can we change the berachot that were enacted? So I'm going to share my source screen, my source sheet with you guys. Although Sina said I didn't have to make a source sheet, I was going to try to not make one, but I just couldn't resist. So let me forward it. Or if you forward it to everybody. Okay, let me just share my screen. Alrighty, so let's jump into the sugya. Let me move you guys to a different screen. Okay, so the Gemara in Berakhot, it tells us that the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah tiknu lahem liYisrael berachot, tefilot, kedushot, ve'havdalot. The Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, which were, as the Rambam in his Hagdama, I think it's Halacha 7, he brings down that the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah was started with Ezra, and it went all the way till Shimon HaTzadik, I believe. And it went to Shimon HaTzadik. And there was a member, it was 120 members, and they were the ones that instituted the Berachot. Other things as well, but our focus is it started by them. The Gemara in Berachot in Daf Mem, if we go to the next source, it says, this is regarding changing the Nusach. Before we get into the actual who can create new berachot or who has the power to. Simply from this Gemara, it sounds like the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, they were the ones that initiated it. Could other people also make berachot? We don't know. We're going to see what the Rishonim say. But regarding changing what they say, so there's a machloket in the Gemara Berachot Daf Mem Amud Bet, and it says, Ra'a pat ve'amar, you see bread and you say, Kama na'e pat zo, how beautiful is this bread? Baruch hamakom shebara'ah, blessed be Hashem who created it. Yatzah. So the first Gemara, the first Manda Amar says, you actually fulfill the Hiyuv that the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah did, that you have to make a beracha. Ra'at te'ena ve'amar, you say, same thing, you saw a fig, how beautiful is the fig? Yatza. That's Shitat Rabbi Meir. So Rabbi Meir sounds like you can change the nusach of the beracha, or the nosach. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Kol ha'meshaneh mimatbe'ah shetav'u hachamim beberachot, lo yatza yedei chovato. So Rabbi Yossi, anybody who changes the formulation that the Hachamim established in the Berachot, lo yatsa yedei chovato, you did not fulfill the mitzvah, the rabbinical mitzvah of reciting a beracha. You changed what they told you to say. You changed the formulation. You do not get any mitzvah. Now we have another Gemara. If you go back to Daf Yud Amud Aleph in Berakhot, it says regarding the Berakhot of Shema. So b'shahar mebarech shtayim lefanea ve'achal lechareh. In the morning of in Shema, for the beracha in the morning, you do 2 berachot before and 1 afterwards. Uba'erev mebarech shtayim lefanea u'shtayim lechareh. And at nighttime, 2 before and 2 after. Achat aruka ve'achat ketzara. One is going to be long, one is going to be short. So we'll see what that means. But now, this is very fundamental. Makom she'amru leharich enu rashay lekatzer. Whenever, let's say, the Hachamim established the beracha in a lengthy way, le'arich, which you expound upon, you expand it, you're not allowed to lekatzer shorten this beracha. Let's say vice versa, lekatzer enu rashay leharich. If it's the opposite, if it's a short, Hachamim told us this is a short beracha, you cannot lengthen that beracha. Lahtom, if they told us you have to put a hatima at the end, which means you end it off with a beracha, right? Some berachot, they have a beginning beracha and an end beracha. Some only have a beginning and don't have an end. Some only have an end and not a beginning. So if it's like that, you can't switch the formulation of where a beracha of Shemu Malchut should be. Right? The Gemara as well tells us, the Mishnah tells us that, of course, any beracha that doesn't have Shem Hashem in it, the Shemu Malchut, it's not considered a beracha. So that's what we're referring to, the hatima of in the beginning of the beracha. So now we're going to go to the Rishonim, Harambam. The Rambam in 2 places he talks about this. Once he talks about it in Hilchot Kiryat Shema. That's the first time he mentions the concept of the Berachot and the tzura, the formation of them. And then also in Hilchot Berachot, of course, which is its proper place. So the more lengthy version is in Hilchot Shema. And because that's pretty much where the Gemara, the Mishnah as well in Berachot was talking about. It was going off of the Beracha of Shema. So he says, Berachot elu imshar kol berachot ha'aruchot bifi kol Yisrael. So the Berachot, these ones, along with all the other Berachot, bifi kol Yisrael. Ezra HaSofer u'Beit Dinot tikenu. So Ezra HaSofer, who was the beginning of the Anshe Knesset Gedolah. Interesting, like the Gemara uses Anshe Knesset Gedolah. He says Ezra, which, if you go back to what the Rambam said in Hagdama, is that Ezra, he's referring to the Anshe Knesset Gedolah. Even, of course, later authorities past Ezra. So him and his Beit Din, they tikenum, they established the Berachot. Ve'en adam rashai lifchot mehem velo leosif alehem. So this is very important words. A person is not allowed to lessen the Berachot, the amount of Berachot, and not add to them. So right away, Harambam is telling you that the Berachot come from the Anshe Knesset Gedolah. We are not allowed to remove or add to them. Strictly, we must follow their formations and not make any of our own, or of course, delete any of theirs. And then he repeats what we said in the Mishnah about changing the tzura, the formation of it. Now, if you go to Hilchot Berachot, he says, "Venosach kol berachot Ezra uBeit Dino tikenu." All of the formation of the Berachot, again, he repeats, Ezra and his Beit Din created them. And a person is not allowed to change them. This is very important, Lashon. It says you're not allowed to change them, not add to them, add to the actual, here he's talking about the actual formation of that beracha. And you can't take anything away from that beracha. Now he says, so first he says, it's not fitting, that's his Lashon. It's not fitting for a person to change them. And then he says, and anybody who changes the formulation of the berachot that they establish, you are making a mistake. And of course, you wouldn't be yotzei with the beracha. So the Kesef Mishnah, he points out in this last halakha of Hilchot Berachot from the Rambam, he asks, like, why in the beginning he writes eno ra'ui lishanotam, which means it's not fitting for you to change them. And then he writes eno ela to'eh, and if you did change them, you make a mistake. It's completely like you didn't do the beracha. Therefore, you have to do it again. So the Kesef Mishnah makes tzvei dinim. He says two types of berachot. There's 2 types of mistakes, pretty much. So the first type of mistake is where you're actually saying the actual nosach of the hachamim. However, you're saying it in different words. So you kept the basic formulation. However, you're substituting certain words or enhancing it somehow. So that En ra'ui l'shanotam. You shouldn't change them. But if you did change them, it's not going to be it's not going to make you not be yotzeh the mitzvah, the beracha. However, there's a second type of a type of change, and that's where the Rambam says eno ela to'eh. You're as if you didn't make the beracha, and that's where you actually are changing the kavanah of the beracha. Meaning, for example, in our Gemara we brought down is that if you say, according to Rabbi Meir, Baruch hamakom shebarah, you just say a basic beracha, and it's a beracha kolelet, which means it's encompassing many things without specifying hamotzi. Let's say we're eating bread, you didn't specify hamotzi, you just said, Hashem, you are so great, you made all food. So that's changing really the formulation, completely changing on a higher degree, and therefore that's considered to be to'eh, according to the Kesed Mishnah. That's where, according to the Rambam, you wouldn't be yotzeh at all, you'd have to redo it again. Fine, so that's the two differences of the in the Rambam in Hilchot Berakhot. And again, just to recap, I brought it in the source and on number 1 on the bottom on the footnote is that Hilchot Kiryat Shema, he's really telling us that you're not allowed to add to the Berachot or remove from all the Berachot that were enacted by the Anshe Knesset Gedolah. And in Hilchot Berachot, he's just telling us you can't change the formulation of each specific beracha, each unique specific beracha. So it's important to note that. So now, of course, we have many other Rishonim that agree that you're not allowed to change the formulations of the Berachot. You have the Sefer HaChinuch, he quotes the Rambam. And then he talks about something that we should kind of ask ourselves is that, what do you mean? The Gemara says that, the first Beracha was Moshe Rabbeinu for Birkat Hamazon. Moshe tiken Birkat Hazan, Yoshua Birkat Haaretz, Yoshua did the second Beracha. So how could it be that Ezra was mitaken all these Berachot? But the Gemara tells us, or the Mishnah tells us that it was done by Moshe Rabbeinu, Yoshua, etc., David, Shlomo. So how could that be? And then also we have Atov Mitiv, also that came even later. So he says no, that Ikara Inyan Amruken, the Chachamim or Ezra and his Beit Din, the Yoshua, Moshe Rabbeinu, they created a concept, a basic concept, the Ikar Inyan, the basic concept. However, the actual formulation of what word should go here, there, this, that, and of course the Baruch Ata Amunai Elokeinu Melech Haolam, etc. That was Ezra and Beit Din, and of course you can't change any part of it, and anybody who changes it is a to'eh. They're making a mistake. So now we quoted this last week. Whoever was with us last week, we talked about the famous addition into the Birkat Shema on Shabbat regarding Hakol Yaducha V'Kol Yishbechucha. We talked about it has the interesting how they interpret how the sun used to go below the Rekiah and then through the Rekiah, above the Rekiah during the nighttime. And so we quoted this shortly that Rav David Shelush quoted him, and it's Rav Yehuda Barceloni and his Sefer Haitim. He writes there that of course anybody who changes any of these things is completely going against the Chachamim. We'll quickly read it inside, it's important. He says already, imagine this. He's fighting against the minhag of everybody. He says, Rov mekomot, most places, they go on Shabbat, they add this addition, Hakol Yaducha V'Kol Yishbechucha, etc. V'gomer et ha-beracha kemo b'chol yom. And then they finish off the beracha like the regular nosach of the Shema during the weekday. Right, and just a background information, of course, if you open up the Sidur of Harambam or most other Geonim as well, they don't make any chiluk, any difference between Shabbat for the Berachot of Shema and during the weekday. So he says, V'ha milta achin katav mar Rav Amram. So he says, believe it or not, this is actually brought down, this shinui, this change was introduced in the Sidur of Rav Amram. Most you should know the Nusach Ashkenaz usually is more similar to the to Rav Amram Gaon. And he says, and this is how everybody's following. So it says, Rabbi Yehuda Barceloni, probably in the 11th century, 10th century, Spain, in Catalona, he's saying, I think it's Catalona, he's saying this minhag, even though he's arguing with the Geonim, Rav Amram Gaon, there is no source for this minhag. It's a mistake. Right? Because we only find that the Hamim told us to mention Shabbat in the fourth beracha, ubirkat hamazon. So the fourth beracha of the Amidah and as well as in Birkat Hamazon and Bonei Yerushalayim. V'chol hamaskir shel Shabbat b'shar berachot to'eh. And anybody who mentions anything about Shabbat and any other beracha is a mistake. So we'll continue going past this, but he's learning, and then just important, he says, Velo yatzeh yedei chova. So he's saying, this is actually very strong. Somebody who adds these, which we all pretty much do now, unless you're praying from a different Sidur. Again, I'm not sure about the Spanish Portuguese if they added this, but anybody who adds these additions, according to pretty much most people nowadays, Lo yatzeh yedei chova mipnei shehu mishaneh mimatbeh shetavu chachamim beberachot. He's saying you did not fulfill your chiyuv of saying the berachot of Shema in the morning if you're adding these things which our Sidurim have nowadays, because you changed the nature of the formulation of the beracha. So you see how extreme he took it, is that even any small manipulation of the beracha causes you to lose out on fulfilling the obligation of reciting the beracha. Fine. However, you have Sefer Abatim, Rab David de Estrella. He was in Provence, from Provence, and he had a yeshiva there. Many Sfaradim also went to Provence to study under him. He writes, "Ukovar nitpashet minhag leomro bechol hagalut, v'shamati shenosach ze tiknu hageonim harishonim, v'hem hayu mekubalim min ha'amoraim, leficha ein leshanot minhag." So he comes out, he's saying, listen, Rav Yehuda Barcelona, he says that, okay, but this is already a minhag that's already spread amongst everybody, amongst all communities. And he says, I heard that this was established by the Geonim, the early Geonim, and who received it from the Amoraim, and therefore we shouldn't change it. So that's already one defense for it. Again, Rabbi Yehuda Barcelona didn't care that there was already the minhag, and he didn't care to argue with the Geonim. The Torah brings it down. He says this is a different halakha regarding, this is actually very common amongst Moroccan, probably other North African communities as well. And for sure in Ashkenazi, I'm not sure if they still do it nowadays. I haven't prayed Ashkenazi on Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, but in Moroccans, they do it for Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. It says, it was the Beit Yosef explains that certain tefillot that they would add in during the Berakhot of Kirat Shema. So he says, so it says the Torah that you should not make these interruptions in the Shema. He also was against it. You're changing the matbeah shetivu hachamim. And the Rama, he quotes the Rama that he was asked on this question. The Rama is Rav Moshe Abu Lafia or Halevi Abu Lafia. He was one of the first Rabbanim against Rambam with the whole Rambam controversy. He says, Nishal al zeh ve'eshiv. He was asked about this question and he responds back, Kach ra'inu she'asur le'afsik. Yes, it's forbidden to make these interruptions. And it says, V'harei beferush she'aninu b'makom she'amru lekatzer enu rasha le'arich. It says we learn in the Talmud that it said whenever, or in the Mishnah, whenever Hachamim said it's a long beracha, you can shorten it, or vice versa as well. Which means they're taking this very, very literal. You cannot change, even adding one word. Well, it would be le'arich, or removing one word, of course, would be lekatzer. So therefore, you're not allowed to do that. And again, he brings in so again, if you do these things, you're not yotzeh de chiyuv. Right, so according to them, they wouldn't be very happy with what us Moroccans do, or any other communities, what they do on Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, etc. The Rambam, they asked him, the Hachamim, or people asked him, I don't know where it was from, who asked him, but in a Teshuvah, the Rambam, they asked him, Yorenu hadrato ha'kedusha ha'im mutar lemitpalel le'afsik ben berachot shekodem kirat shema or shelachareya b'devar min ha'piyutim ha'hadashim. They asked him, can we stop in the Shema before or after the Shema, which means in the Berachot of Shema, to add in some nice piyutim, some nice songs that were written by great authors or paitanim. So he says, Teshuvah, le'afsik benehen b'devar min ha'piyutim hu mishgeh v'ta'ut gemura. He says to make any interruption is a complete mistake. Ve'en panim lehatiro. There's no way that you can actually allow this. V'chol sheken she'asu le'afsik b'piyutim elu betoch ha'berachot. And for sure, in the Berachot, you cannot. So again, the Rambam was against it. So now, what about those who allowed it? So we have Rashba, I think was one of the first ones to defend the minhag. Again, this is, people always want to say that the Rambam followed minhag Geonim. The Rambam here is going against minhag Geonim. The Geonim were adding these things, at least we saw from Avram Gaon. Of course, it's very hard to say all Geonim are one school of thought. You have so many different Geonim with different personalities and different shitot and different halachot, different psakim. So the Rashba, he was defending the practice, which happened to be a very common practice. You see, everybody's talking about it. It was a hot topic, just like this topic was in the Habura chat. So it was a very hot topic back then. And he says, "V'nireh li demai de'amru makom shamu lekatzer eno rasha le'arich umakom shamu le'arich eno rasha lekatzer." So that we said you're not allowed to change the length of the Berachot. Lav le'memra she'eno rasha lekatzer u'le'arich benosach haBeracha. So this is a novel interpretation. He's saying it doesn't mean that you're not allowed to change, to shorten and lengthen the actual text of the beracha. Klomar lerabot u'lilma'et b'milotea, which means you can't increase or decrease the words, the amount of words in the beracha. Why? This is a beautiful proof, actually. The imken haya lahem letaken nosach kol beracha u'beracha b'milot minuyot u'beinyanim miduim. Because if that was the case, then the Chachamim, Chazal, they should have gave us pretty much a printout, a handout of every single beracha and what words have to go inside of it, right? Anybody who's reading the Gemara, sometimes it's just very mikatzered. It brings the beracha and it quotes it, the 3-4 words, and that's it. And you don't know the rest of the beracha. And that's why almost every sidur has such different texts, because we're all lost in which beracha is the proper beracha. Again, this is one school of thought. There's an opposite school of thought you could say is that no, there was really one sidur, and we just lost it. And Harambam actually tried his best to find what's the real nosach. You know, he got the girsaot of the Temanim, and then he changed a lot of his previous types of tefillah that he used to pray. So that school thought that no, there was really one type of tefillah with every single word precise, and therefore and we must follow that, and we must try to reconstruct that to the best of our ability. But the Rashba is saying that no, we don't have such a thing like that, and therefore he says they should have gave us a handout with every single type of text. Right? Teach us that the formation of each and every beracha. And we don't find that anywhere. And we actually only find sometimes certain Gemarot, they talk about what words are very important and crucial for the beracha. For example, kol shelo amar berit ba'aretz, or shelo yisken malchut beDavid. Right, in Birkat Hamazon, Chachamim tell us if you don't say berit, you're not going to be yotzei. If you don't mention malchut beDavid in that beracha, the Birkat Hamazon, you're not going to be yotzei the beracha. So therefore, he says, but for all the other berachot, we don't have any, we're kind of lost. So therefore, he holds that you're allowed to add and remove certain words. There's not any defined structure that we're bound to in regard to that. So therefore, he says, and he actually a beautiful proof as well. Not only that, explicitly the Chachamim told us for the Amidah, the Shemona Esrei, that you're allowed to actually you're allowed to pray, or you're allowed to add whatever you want regarding each and every beracha of the Amidah, right? Of course, within that context, we're talking about Refa'inu Amonai, you're allowed to actually add in, supplications regarding refuah for people. You're allowed to add certain things in each and every beracha. So it says, so rather, he says, there's no hakpada, we're not so particular about each and every word. Rather, what does it mean, the formulation that we have to be stringent on, we're not allowed to change? He says, meaning, saying, all that means is very simply, we cannot, if a beracha starts with Baruch, right, Asher Yatzar, it starts with the Baruch, Hatamonai, and it ends with one. So you cannot remove that Baruch from the beginning and just only keep the ending. You have to keep that structure. So he's saying only the outside general structure of each beracha is what you must keep, but the words inside you can play around. Fine. The Ritva as well. He has a different take on it. He says, he's like this. Nagu lomar piutim be'emsa berachot kirat shema. Again, he brings in that custom that they would say different berachot in kirat shema. He says, but why is that okay? Lefi she'en mosifin ken bekiviut ela derech arai b'shabbatot shel simcha bilvad. He says, because we don't always have these additions in the beracha. We only have them on special occasions. On Shabbatot, we would add certain piutim in, etc. Or on Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, he doesn't mention that. But so he's saying is that when Chachamim were against changing the structure of the beracha, that was referring to permanent changes. But when you're just, every now and then changing a little bit, that's okay, because you're always going back to the original structure. Fine. Okay, yeah. I just brought another tissue on the bottom before when I mentioned the Rambam arguing on the Geonim. The Geonim, they have a lot of different piyutim as well that they would sing on Shabbat or mention on Shabbat. And the Rambam was very neged this minhag because they're mentioning things that are bakasha and you're not allowed to ask, request things on Shabbat. So he argued with all the Geonim and he said, don't, or not all the Geonim, but whatever Geonim that would sing these things on Shabbat. And he said, don't mention these things. Fine. Shulchan Aruch halach lema'aseh. What does the Shulchan Aruch posek like? Like the Rambam. Yesh mekomot shemafsikin beberachot kirat shema lomar piyutim. Says there are certain locations, communities that they have these different interruptions of adding songs into the Shema, into the Berachot of Shema. It's proper to refrain from doing these things because it is considered an interruption. Okay, so that is how the Shulchan Aruch posek. Nowadays, like I mentioned, some communities go like the Rashba, the Ritva, and others, Hamovadia, was very strict to go like the Shulchan Aruch simply, and like the Rambam, not to change. So that's on a high level regarding the actual structure of each beracha. What about, now this is the more juicy stuff, what about adding new berachot? So we mentioned that one Rambam above, that in Hilchot, was it in Shema? Sorry, it was in Hilchot Berachot. No, Hilchot Shema. That, I was wrong. Hilchot Kiryat Shema, right? En Adam Rashai lefchot mehem v'lo leosif alehem. In Hilchot Shema, he says you're not allowed to add or decrease from the berachot. Simply, you can't make post-Talmudic, let's say, berachot, or maybe post-Amoraic. Amoraic, is that how you say it? I'm not sure. Fine. So we're going to first look at one beracha of what we all know, which you can ask many people and they're not going to really know so much about this, but the source of the beracha of Ner Shabbat, right? We all, pretty much everybody nowadays says the beracha la'alik ner shel Shabbat. So where is the mikor for this, right? So if you open up the Rambam in Mishneh Torah, of course everybody admits that there is a chiyuv to light a candle, to light lights for Shabbat. You know, we on Bamei Madlikin have a whole mishnayot about it. But what about the source for reciting an actual beracha? So it says the Rambam, you just read the Rambam, the chayav levarech kodem hadlakat. Before you light, you have an obligation to recite a beracha, right? This is Shitat Rambam or Shitat Talmud, simply, is that you always have to recite the beracha before you do the action. Over la'asiyatan. So it says he says, chayav levarech, you have an obligation to make the beracha before you light. Baruch atah Hashem l'keram melech haolam, asher kiddushanu v'zevanu, la'alik ner shel Shabbat. Right? That's what I'm sure everybody says. Maybe there's different argument, I don't know. Not that I'm aware of, but that's the thing. Fine. And he says, just like you have to make a beracha for anything that is obligated rabbinically, which is interesting why the Rambam had to add that in here. But he adds that, there's other berachot he mentions. He doesn't mention this extra wording. Just like you have to recite for every other beracha, for every other mitzvah d'Rabbanan. So now going into the historical analysis of the beracha of Shabbat, I found in Rabbi Ratzon Arusi, which is he gave beautiful shiurim in the Haburan for the Hebrew part division. That's better word. He says there's a journal called Sinai, and there he goes through a whole thing regarding the beracha of Ner Shel Yom Tov. What about lighting candles on Yom Tov? So first of all, that itself isn't so clear. It's not brought down anywhere in the Mishnah, anywhere in the Talmud, and anywhere in the Geonim, believe it or not. To even have berachot, or to even have halakad ner for Yom Tov, it's not found in the early Geonim, of course, and everything above that. So regarding when he's discussing that, he goes into the whole concept of even Ner Shabbat. So here, I just brought his words here. Let's read it through. He says, "Beracha al Ner Shabbat nizkeret rishona beseder Rav Amram b'sidur Rav Amram Gaon." The first mention of a beracha for Shabbat, for Ner Shabbat, is in the Sidur of Rav Amram Gaon. Lachar mikan anu motziim besefer halachot gedolot, Rabbi Shimon Kiara, or Kaira, people say, ki Rabbi Netruna Gaon, hore sheish levarech al Ner Shabbat. So the first time we find it is Rav Amram Gaon, and then after in a later sefer in the Hilchot Gedolot, which is also from the Geonim, he ruled that you have to, in the name of Rabbi Natan Gaon, that you must recite the Berakhah when you're doing the candles for Shabbat. So mizeh nuchal lilmod. So this is Rav Arusi saying, from this we can learn ki biyameim haya safek im yesh levarech al ner Shabbat. During their time, during the days of the Geonim, there was a doubt if you even have to recite a Berakhah for ner Shabbat. The omnam safek zeh lo pasak. This doubt never stopped. We're going to see why that happens, why or how did that continue not to stop. And he says the nosach of the beracha of Ner Shabbat, it was different than what we actually do nowadays. For example, in the Sidur of Sadia Gaon, you go down a little bit, we have the text is lifnei. He says right there, I added this in from the actual Sidur. Lifnei shikiyat hama biyom shishi chova she'alik ner. Kol Shabbat. Every Shabbat you have to, of course, obligation to recite to light a candle. And he says this is very important. Ve'rubeinu mivarech alav le'alik ner haShabbat. And most of us recite a beracha le'alik ner Shabbat. So Rav Sadia Gaon is telling us most of us do, but some of us don't. So again, you see back then that there was it wasn't so obvious to everybody to make a beracha and unanimous to make a beracha. Right, so that's what Rav Rusi he points out. Right, so he says, "Ve'af al pi she'arov birchu al ner shel Shabbat mitbarer ki besof tekufat hageonim adayin lo haya barur im haberacha hilchata or minhaga." He says, even though most people started doing the beracha, however, it wasn't so clear if it was just a minhag. This beracha was on a minhag, right? It's a whole other shiur. If can you make a beracha on a minhag? Or is it a halacha that no, this beracha was enacted by the Chachamim? So he says only to Rav Shirida Gaon or Rav Hai Gaon in the Tishuot Geonim, they actually establish it like it's a halacha and not just a minhag. However, so the Geonim, they were living in the opposite side of the planet, and then you had the Chachmei Provence, the Ashkenazim, and in the Balei Tosafot, they continued this machloket even past the Geonic era, right? So for example, he says, in Sarfat, we see this machloket, so it was a burning machloket, it was a fiery discussion regarding, do you make a beracha for Ner Shel Shabbat? Rabbeinu Tam, he says that you should make the beracha. However, he argued with Rabbeinu Meshulam that was very against making the beracha, again, because you don't find it anywhere in Shas. And he said that to Rabbi Eliyahu mi Paris, these were great Geonim of Ashkenaz, of Sarfat, or Provence, that they did not make the beracha. Right, and even, he says, 100 years after Rabbeinu Tam, we still find that in Sarfat they were noig like Rabbeinu Tam. However, there were some still that did not go like Rabbeinu Tam. They went like Rabbeinu Meshulam, for example. For example, he says in Sefer Amudei Gola, which is called Mitzvot Katan, it says Yesh Hachamim shemitzuvin levarech veyesh shemitzuvin shelo levarech. Right, 100 years later, past Rabbeinu Tam, it was still machloket. Do you bless? Some Hachamim said you make the beracha on Ner Shabbat, and others say you don't. However, he says the minhag already became like Rabbeinu Tam in Be'artzenu or in Be'eretz Azot. Fine. So therefore, we're not going to go into this too much, but he talks about how he makes the kal vachomer. If it was a machloket by Shabbat, kal vachomer by halakat ner for Yom Tov, which you don't find anywhere in the Talmud, and like we mentioned, the Geonim. Of course, in the Rambam as well, does not mention making a beracha on Yom Tov for the Ner Yom Tov. And a simple reason, just think, what's the reason behind Ner Shabbat? Ner Shabbat, the reason is because the Gemara says Shalom Bayit. Simply, you want Shalom Bayit. However, on Yom Tov, there's not a problem of Shalom Bayit. Why? Of course, there's a problem with Shalom Bayit, but there's not a problem that can come to have problems with Shalom Bayit. Why? Because you need fire. Ma'avir Esh. Yom Tov, you're allowed to be Ma'avir Esh. So what's the point of Hachamim enacting Halakat Ner Shel Yom Tov when you could just, on Yom Tov, you don't have to make any preparations. You need a fire, you need light. Oh, no problem. Continue that light from a different fire. Or move the fire around. It's not mukse. It's not a problem. So that's Rav Arusi on that. So now, in the Teshuvot of Rav Kafech, I found something fascinating. He goes into the reason, the whole question, a big question that everybody is dealing with all the time. Can you make the beracha of Lalik Ner Shel Shabbat on hashman, on electricity? Right? This is always a very, very common question. He brings down Rav Haller Halib, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that properly. He says that you can make the beracha on hashmal. You can make lehalik ner shel Shabbat, not a problem. And he brings down Hamobadi as well. Held that you could do that as well. However, he says this is actually in the comments of the Teshuvah. I put the shoot away, but in the shoot of Rav Kafech, his Talmid, he writes, he says, Ledato shel Mari, according to my Rabbi, Rav Yosef Kafech, the reason why, this is fascinating, the reason why the Beracha was enacted for La'alik Ner Shel Shabbat was in order to fight against the Karaim, the Karaites. Shipirshu et hane'emar b'Torah, because they understood what the Torah mentioned. Lo tivaru esh bechol mishvotechem b'yom HaShabbat. You're not allowed to have fire in where you live on Shabbat. Shelo tieh esh bo'eret b'yom HaShabbat. That you're not allowed to have fire that's lit. You can't have an active fire. Even if you lit it before Shabbat, you can't have an active fire on Shabbat. Right? They would sit in the dark on the entire Shabbat, on nighttime. The kevan shiladata karaim hashmal enu nechshav esh. So now look, Rav Kaffa, he says beautifully, he says, and according to the karaim, hashmal, electricity is not considered fire. Im ken beracha al ner Shabbat hayevet liot al ner shel esh dafka. So therefore, when you're going to light the beracha, or you're going to make the beracha for the ner Shabbat, you need to have a real fire. You can't use electricity. So Rav Kaffa is not getting into what Hachamim wanted. According to Hachamim, which means Chazal in the Mishnah, when they enacted to have ner Shabbat, could be electricity works. However, the Beracha was post-Talmudic. It came in the time of the Geonim in order, as a result, to fight against the Karaim. And therefore, since Karaim don't think Hashmal is considered fire, you cannot use electricity for the mitzvah of ner Shabbat. ובתלמוד נזכר להדליק נר של שבת משום שלום בית, right? אבל לא נזכר לברך על נר זה, right? He's just repeating what we just mentioned. It talks about בימים מדליקים, you have to have נר של שבת for שלום bait, but it doesn't talk about the beracha. ובeracha נתגננה מאוחר יותר כנגד דעתם של הקרים. So he just reinforces what we said. It goes against the karaim. And then he has a whole thing about electricity, if electricity is really fire or not, or he says lighting electricity is just like static, and he says that really wouldn't be ish. We're not going to get into that. That's a whole other very controversial topic on Shabbat. But Rav Kafek, very interestingly, he allows you to even touch electric watch on Shabbat and move it around, meaning press the buttons. It wouldn't be a problem to him because it's not whatever. I'm going to get in trouble for them. Okay. Anyways, Rav David Shelush. Rav David Shelush. Of course, I like to bring Rav David Shelush. So a lot of his teshuvot are arguing with his good friend Ham Ovadia Yosef, alav shalom. And Rav Ovadia Yosef, of course, he has a very big mission statement, not a mission statement, but a very big statement that everybody has to first, for Halakha Nerot Shabbat, everybody has to first say the beracha, like the Rambam said, and then light over Asiyatan. Even though most Faradim, believe it or not, did not have that custom. You go to Morocco, they didn't have that custom. The Kafahin, the Ben Ishai, so many people all around the world. You can ask almost pretty much most, if you're a Sephardic, if you ask your great-great-grandmother, if she's still alive, they did like the Ashkenazim, which is Sefer Bahag, which they would first light and then recite the Beracha. That was the most Poshet Minhag, it was the most spread across Minhag. So Ham Ovadia really was against that Minhag. And everybody is fighting about, should we change our minhag, especially when you're in Eretz Yisrael? And even if you're not in Eretz Yisrael, maybe you should change your minhag because perhaps it's a beracha levatala, right? It has to be over lesiyatan. You have to first say the beracha and then do the action. Maybe if you don't do it, how can you if you switched it, you did the mitzvah and then you're making the beracha, maybe you don't get it's a beracha levatala. It was a blessing in vain. So Rav Ovadia, he brings in Maran Shulchan Aruch. And we're going to read the Lashon of Maran Shulchan Aruch. He says, "K'shiadlik yivarech baruch ata Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu mitzvotav zivanu la'alik ner shel Shabbat. Echad ha'ish ve'echad ha'isha da 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 da." So he says, very interesting. Maran Bet Yosef. He says, "K'shiadlik yivarech." He left it very ambiguous. What k'shiadlik? Usually you would say no. Yivarech ve'achar kach. Right? Well, that was the Lashon of the Rambam. You make the beracha and then you light. But Maran Bet Yosef, he left it very ambiguous. He said, "K'shiadlik." That could be before, afterwards. some want to even learn that Maran saying not like Rav Ovadia, Lik, which means first you light, Yevarech, then you make the beracha. But simply he left it very ambiguous. And now comes in Rav David Shelush and he's arguing with Rav Ovadia. He says, V'chi Maran lo yed'a hai kelala de safek berachot lehakel. Right? Because Rav Ovadia is saying, safek berachot lehakel, you cannot do like the Sefer Bahag, which means when you first, if the Bahag background information, he says, if you're gonna say the beracha and then light, perhaps through the beracha you already accepted Shabbat upon yourself, and therefore you can't do the melacha anymore. So Rav Ovadia tries to push off that shita. He says that the dat yachid, there's a few people that held like that, but majority don't hold like that. But however, Maran was very satum. So, and Rav Ovadia is saying, Safek berachot lahakel, we can't go with that opinion. We have to go with like the Rambam shita. So Rav David Shelush is saying against Rav Ovadia, did Maran did not know about this concept of Safek berachot lahakel? V'savarta Rambam, v'rova poskim, the beracha levatalahi. Of course he knew that it was a beracha levatala. If, according to the Rambam, that if you're going to not do over l'siyatan, it's a problem. V'lama Maran, so why did Maran, the Shulchan Aruch, b'Beit Yosef, lo dacha b'pashtu divrei bahag mitam zeh? How come we didn't push away the shita of the bahag, which is first you light and then make the beracha? So ela sheyesh le'ashiv al kach shelo amru shemevarech achar asiyat mitzvah havi beracha levatala ela bivracha shikara min ad-din. So this is beautiful. This is going off what Rav Kafach as well, and what we learned before, is that perhaps Rav David Shelush is saying is that we only have this hakpada, we're very stringent about first doing the beracha and then the action when it's a beracha that we must do min ad-din, which means from the bet din hagadol, the anshe knesset gadola, when they enacted the beracha, that we have to be very careful with. First say the beracha and then do the action. That's when we say over l'asiyatan. Aval bivracha she'enu min ad-din. However, by a beracha that's not from the anshe knesset gedola, shomrim shelo mivarchim oto klal, and there's other people like we said, Rabbeinu Mishulam, that they say you don't even make a beracha on Ner Shabbat. V'nagu levarechota, and we have a custom to make a beracha. It's just a custom. Gam zman beracha eno ela minhag. So also, this is the chidush. He's saying so too. The beracha itself, it's just a minhag. The zman of the beracha, the timing of the beracha. If you're going to do it before and afterwards, it's also just a custom. He's saying everybody just take a chill pill. It's just a custom here. Who cares if you're going to make the beracha before or afterwards? It's just a custom. The English shum noheg minhag halomar noheg minhag acher birchatech levatala birchatech levatala mishum she'eno noheg kamoni. He says, and nobody can say, oh, my custom is better than your custom, and if you're doing it your custom, that's a beracha levatala. He's saying we can't play that game here because this is just a custom. Actually, I didn't bring it down, but Rav Kafach, he actually brings down that in the Magid Mesharim, that the Beit Yosef as well, he actually held that he hints to that the whole beracha of Ner Shabbat was to go against the Karaim as well. So it wasn't just like Rav Kafach inventing this; he brings sources for this. So therefore, he says those who want. Rav David Shelush finalizes. He says those who want to follow the custom of the Bahag, which is pretty much the universal custom of all Sfaradim except for recently. Of course, I'm sure there's exceptions, but most people. Maybe I don't know the Syrians how they were doing it, but I even heard Syrians too as well. They were following like the Bahag, that first they do the first they light and then do the beracha. Leave it, no problem. Continue it because we're just dealing with the minhag. So everybody just relax. Again, I hear people making all this diukim from the beracha le'alik ner shel Shabbat and hachamim, since they made the lashon like that. Therefore, you can't use hashmal because of that. So I mean, we can't really bring proofs from the beracha, because the beracha itself is a post-Talmudic beracha. So therefore, all Rav Kafach, he has a beautiful nafkamina saying, since the whole point is to fight against the karaim, so therefore we do bring a nafkamina in the beracha itself, which means you have to do it on fire. However, we can't be so meduyak on the beracha itself because it's a post-Talmudic beracha. Fine. So that was Ner Shabbat. Now we're going to go through a couple other berachot that are post-Talmudic. There's really a bunch of them. You have so many. You have Baruch Shepatrani for the bar mitzvah. You have, I think Ashkenazim recite it, She'asali kirsono, right, for women that they can't say Shelo asani ish. Sorry, Shelo asani isha. So they have a different beracha for them. These are all, you don't find these in the Talmud. But we're going to just focus on a few more that are very interesting. So Birkat Betulim. So this is a very interesting beracha. is that somebody who married a betula and they had their relations on the night of the chuppah or whenever it was, according to, even we're going to see soon, but a spoiler alert, according to the Shulchan Aruch, sounds like you actually take a kiddush cup and you make a beracha, Hashem, thank you so much that you gave me a betula, a virgin. So yeah, the Rosh himself brings this beracha down, and he says at the end, after he brings it, he says, "Ve'efshar sheberacha zo tiknu hageonim." Perhaps this beracha was enacted by the geonim. Umistavar leveracha achar shematza betulim. And he says, first do the action, and then afterwards make the beracha. So even though usually, over la siyatan, in this case, of course, you don't want to make a beracha levatala. So first find out that she's a betula, she's a virgin, and then you make the beracha afterwards. So now the Yam Shel Shelomo, right, Rabbi Luria, who was a very fierce opponent of the Shulchan Aruch, he talks about this beracha, and he questions the Rosh. He says, "V'tema." What a astonishment! Since this beracha is not anywhere in the Gemara, it's not anywhere in the Tosefta, any external works of the Chachamim, of the Chazal. How can we add a new beracha? And he says on the Rosh, the Rosh himself in Sefer Bechorot, I brought it down on the bottom, in Kiddushin as well, he brings it down, that there's another beracha that people would do, Asher Kidesh Ubar B'mei Imo, right? There was they do the Pidyon Haben, there's a beracha that's recited after the whole ceremony. And the Rosh there himself says that we should not make that beracha. He brings down that the Sfaradim were making it, but Ashkenazim, we don't make that beracha. This is when he moved to Spain. And so the Rosh himself says, since it's after the Talmud, it came after the Talmud, we don't have a right to make any beracha. So the Yam Shel Shlomo, he's asking the Rosh, how can you say to make this beracha, and you're even admitting that it's Tiknu Geonim, the Geonim did it? You're not allowed to do that, right? He says, the Rosh himself says, She'en mevarchin shum beracha lo huskara b'mishnah. If it's shelo huskara b'mishnah, any beracha that's not mentioned in the Mishnah or in the Tosefta or in the Gemara, you're not allowed to mention that. Ki yachar sidur Rabinu v'Rav Ashi lo matzinu shenithadesh shum beracha. This is very important. He says, after the sealing of the Talmud of Rabbi Rav Ashi, we are not allowed to make new berachot. So he says, so he says, if you want to say it, just don't say Baruch Ata Monai. Just skip Baruch Ata or Baruch Badadadada. Fine. Shulchan Aruch, again, I did the spoiler to the before the spoiler before. He says, Ve'ish Omrim, She'ach Shematza Betulim Mebarech Baruch Ata Hashem Yechala. He says it. Asher Tzag Egoz Began Eden. You guys can Google the translation for that one. It's very interesting beracha. The Ramah brings down that you should say with a kos, with a kiddush cup. And usually the general rules for Shulchan Aruch, when he just brings down Ve'yesh Omrim, most of the poskim nowadays, they hold that means he didn't find anybody arguing on the beracha or on this halacha, and therefore he's really promoting this, that we should do it. He just wrote Ve'yesh Omrim because he didn't find it in the Rambam or didn't find it in other shitot. But it sounds like he's promoting it. Of course, we're going to see a stira soon in Shulchan Aruch. The Rambam in Shut Pe'er Hador, so Rav David Yosef, actually the son of Rav Vadia, he published a beautiful set of or Teshuvot of the Rambam called Pe'er Hador, and he talks. They ask him about this beracha. They ask Harambam about this beracha. He says, "Omnam beracha zot hanikret birkat betulim." He says, however, this beracha that you call the blessing of the virgin, harehi beracha levatala beli safek. He says, for sure, this is a blessing in vain. Kihu davar miguneh. It's something that's disgusting. Lo yadati lama yesoda velama tiknu ba kiddush. I have no clue why anybody, made this beracha, and why did they establish to have a kiddush cup like the Ramah brought also the korinoto kiddush betulim, and they even called it the kiddush betulim. You have Shabbat kiddush and you have kiddush betulim. Ein lecha davar miguneh mizeh. There's nothing more disgusting than this. Umi shehu bal sechel al yitraei atzmo behabura kegon zot. It's a mistake. Bektav Moshe. He says, and somebody who has any brains to them, do not associate yourself with these type of people. And Moshe, he ends off with his signature. So the Rambam felt that this is a beracha that's, it's a busha for Am Yisrael to make a berachot on these type of things, these lowly things. However, there is a question. We do in the ketubah, we talk about betula, but that's more of a value worth. Mashen can hear you're making a beracha on the fact that you found out that she's a betula. So the Rambam saying that's, it sounds like more of a other type of religion. I'm not going to say which religion type of thing, but not ours. Fine. So now another beracha, very, very, very controversial. I heard it's controversial in England as well. Birkat hanoten la'ya'if koach, right? The beracha that I'm sure a lot of people say it in the morning. Again, I'm not sure what the Spanish Portuguese. I have to get one of those sidurim. If somebody can send me a PDF for that. But actually, most people say it. Hamuvadi himself says it. Almost every sidur says it. Only the last, pretty much, people I know of in Morocco that didn't say it are the Hachamim from Meknes, from one city where my great-great-grandparents came from. Rav Shalom Mishash also brought down not to say this beracha, but this is the beracha that's in our sidur in the Birkat HaShachar, in the morning Berakhot. So it says the Torah brings down that Od beracha had yesh b'surah Ashkenaz. There's another beracha in the Ashkenazi sidurim, and it's hanoten la'ya'if koach, right? And he brings the reason behind this. He says, why was this beracha created? Because a person, he stores his soul at nighttime in the hands of HaKadosh Baruch Hu after it's tired from working the whole day. And then Hashem gives it back to us fresh and ready to work again. And it's based off the Midrash, Hadashim lebekarim Rabbi Munatecha, which means, what does the Midrash say? That's a pasuk. He says, Basar v'dam mafkid pikadon biyad haviro mahziro balui mikulkal. When a person, a human, he gives an item, he deposits an item, he lends an item to somebody, he gets it back all worn out and ruined. However, when you give your soul to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you get it back all nice and perfect and fresh again. So that's why, which is very interesting, that based off of Midrash, this beracha was enacted, which is a whole other topic. How do you learn Midrashim, and how can you make even berachot based off Midrashim? Which is actually, it's common in the Shita Tosafot, but not so common in other schools of thought. So the Beit Yosef here, remember what the Beit Yosef said by Birkat Betulim. But here, he says, Afal pi sheish samach yafeh levarech berachazo. He says, yeah, I love the reasoning is beautiful that the Torah brought down. However, since it was not mentioned in the Gemara, I have no clue how anybody can make this beracha. How can anybody establish this beracha if it's not written if it wasn't brought in Shas, it wasn't brought in the Gemara? And he brings down the Rambam, the Smag, all these other poskim, they didn't bring it down. And then there's another beracha, Magbi Shefalim, that also that he says not, he's against to do it. So Shulchan Aruch, how is the Shulchan Aruch posek in his book of Codex, in the Shulchan Aruch? He says, Yesh noaging levarech hanoten la'ya'if koach, ve'en divrehem nirin. Says the Shulchan Aruch, people make this beracha, but it doesn't seem reasonable to do it, and you shouldn't do it. Pretty much he's saying you should not make this beracha. However, the Ramah says that minhag pashu b'nei Ashkenaz the Umrah. In Ashkenaz they were saying it. Sounds like from Shulchan Aruch. It wasn't a Sephardi minhag to say the beracha. Also, regarding other berachot, he says, don't make other berachot. It's a ta'ud biyadam. People who add other berachot to the Birkat HaShachar is a mistake. So now we get into a fascinating topic. How did it happen that the beracha hanoten la'ya'if koach spread amongst the entire Sephardi world as well? So the Chida he brings down in his Sefer Birkei Yosef is that ve'ata nitpashet minhag b'geliotenu levarech zot beracha al pi kitvei Rabbeinu ha'Arizal. So nowadays we recite this beracha because of the writings of the Arizal. Ki af dikibalnu horaot Maran. Even though yes, we accept the teachings of Maran, right? He is our Rabbi. Kimlan de ilmale Maran afur adat hakadosh ha'Arizal gam hu yodeh livracha. He says that if Maran, the Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Cairo, would have seen the reasoning behind the Arizal of why you should make the beracha, he would have retracted from what he said in the Shulchan Aruch and even make the beracha. And on top of it, the Chida brings down that it's the Knesset HaGedolah, which is a Rav from Turkey, he writes that people heard, there's a rumor that Maran Beit Yosef, he was Hozerbo. He retracted from saying not to make the beracha. And therefore, it's proper to make the beracha because the Arizal said so. And perhaps even Maran retracted from what he said. Udelo ke pri hadash. And this is not like the pri hadash said, the Rav Hezkel de Silva, he says, no, you don't make the beracha. Now, Tov Ayin, another sefer, he says, this is just defending the practice again and defending the berachot that the Arizal did. Right? There's a whole, everybody knows, Safek berachot lehakel. And we even say afilu neged Maran, even against Maran Shulchan Aruch we do it. However, many poskim hold. Let's say you open up the Or Litzion of Rabbi Sun Abashul. He says, however, lo amrin, and we don't say safek berachot neged ha'arizal. When the Arizal says something, no, even if he says the berachah that's not mentioned in the Talmud, and he says to say it, we say it, right? And he says the Tov Ayin. He says, Maran Shulchan Aruch u'shar rabbanim lo yid'u echad mimea migdolat Rabbeinu ha'arizal. The Shulchan Aruch, as well as other rabbanim, which is pretty fascinating because they were living in the same town in Sfat, but nevertheless, he says they didn't know how great, 1/100th of the greatness of the Arizal. And the Arizal died while Maran was alive. And it's possible, he's saying again, it's just theoretically possible that Maran heard from one of the Talmidim of the Arizal that you should make the Berakhot, and therefore Maran would retract from what he wrote. Which again, it's very hard to believe this because, there's many Sfarim that came after Maran that he wrote, or different correction that he would have written, and we don't have that anywhere. Fine. Another Sefer, Matzat Shimurim, he says, Bevadai Rabbeinu Arizal shesovre sheish leomra beruach hakodesh neemra lo. Right? He says Rabbeinu HaKodesh, which is the Arizal, he says to make this Berakhot because he got it through Ruach HaKodesh. He had Ruach HaKodesh, so therefore, of course, we have to make the Berakhot. So now, Yabia Omer, Chacham Ovadia. How does Chacham Ovadia deal with this? So yeah, Chacham Ovadia, he really went against the trend of many Sfaradim in their acceptance of the Arizal as a, to not say Safek Berakhot neged Arizal. He didn't hold of this thing, and we're going to see it soon. And he has a problem because at the one hand, he says it, and he says to say it because it's the minhag, but at the same time, he doesn't like the reason why we say it, which means we say it because the Arizal says to say it. So how does he deal with this stira? So he says like this. This concept or this assumption that if the Shulchan Aruch, the Beit Yosef, would have seen the words of the Arizal, he would have retracted from his words. En la hechrach. He says this has no strength. Right? Even though Arizal was so great in the hidden of the Torah, the hidden works of the Torah, and he was we posek lo bashamayim. The Torah is not in heaven; it's here on earth. And where's the source for this in all Talmudic law and any of the Rishonim that we should ditch or abandon the words of the majority of the Rishonim, or the Poskim, and go after the Arizal like it's halacha leMoshe Misinai, right? We don't find this, you do find it, but only from the works after the Arizal, but we don't find that anywhere in the early Poskim. So how can we go with this concept, right? He brings down the Rambam in Perush Mishnayot that says that even if you have 1,000 Nevi'im saying one halacha, and they're like the level of Eliyahu Navi or an Elisha, and you have 1,001 Hachamim, but not Nevi'im, arguing, who do you go like? The 1,001 Hachamim versus the 1,000 Nevi'im that are some of the greatest Nevi'im in the world. Because again, it's Lo B'Shamayim here. So therefore he says, so even though the Arizal was so great, and he was like Nechshav Kehad Min Kameh, he was like one of the early, we consider him to be like the early authorities. Nevertheless, when the Rishonim argue, we go after their words. Now this is very fascinating. A lot of Sephardi guys maybe get upset about this one. It says, when I say Sephardi, I mean like more Ben Ish Chai oriented, etc. It says, and if you look at the words that the Igrot HaTanya, which is, he brought down Rabbeinu Hagra, I think it's also brought down in the Masei Rav as well. And a sefer of these are all Talmidim of the Gaon de Vilna. He says that the Rabbeinu Hagra lo haya ma'amin shekabalat Rabbeinu Arizal bichlala hi kula mipi Eliyahu. The Vilna Gaon is saying, he didn't believe that all of the words of the Arizal came from Eliyahu Navi. Right? All the Mikubalim, they believe he had a Gilu Eliyahu, or Eliyahu Navi revealed himself to the Arizal. However, Rak me'at mizar mipi Eliyahu. Only it says the Gaon de Vilna, only a few things here and there came from Eliyahu Navi. But the rest came from his own chokhmah, his own wisdom. So therefore, what does this do? pretty much Hamobadi is saying is that this converts the Arizal from being, halacha Moshe Messinai because he has the Gilo Eliyahu, all the way down to a regular posek. Because since majority of his words are not from Eliyahu Navi, therefore we have to, treat him like a regular posek, and therefore his opinion is going to be batel against Rov Rishonim or Rov Poskim, right? And therefore he goes against the Ben Ishai who writes, right? Even though we say Safik Berakhot, this is I mentioned in the name of Rabbi Abba Shaul, but the Ben Ishai as well. Even though we say Safik Berakhot Neged Maran, however, when it's the Arizal, we should say the Beracha. We don't say Safik Berakhot, right? He says Rav Ovadia, very strong words. He got in trouble for these when he was younger. These words of the Ben Ishai don't seem like this is the halacha, right? We should say that there's a doubt if we should recite this blessing against Arizal. Mistake here. But unless there is, the only time we don't say Safek Berachot, so this is how Hamovadia pretty much is allowing himself to recite this Beracha, is if the minhag already spread through Am Yisrael, then we continue saying the Beracha, which is a very interesting point, because we saw, for example, Rav Yehuda Barceloni, remember above, he mentioned that yes, even though everybody is making a hefsek and adding piyutim in the Berachot of Shema, I don't care, ta'ut, it's a mistake and they should retract. Hamuvadi is saying, no, it's the minhag was poshet and therefore everybody does it, so therefore you continue doing the Beracha. The only problem with this is that, in my opinion, is that the minhag itself spread. Why? Because of the Arizal. If it wasn't for the Arizal and the Chida really pushing it, that this concept, the Beracha wouldn't have spread to all Sephardi lands. So therefore, how could it be that it's like circular reasoning? We say this Beracha because that's the minhag, but we do say Safek Berachot Neged Arizal, when the only reason why the Beracha was pushed was because the Arizal pushed for it. So therefore, it's very hard. And Hamovadia, they try. He has other attempts. I shouldn't say attempts. Who am I to say that? But he says, for example, he brings down other snif lehakel, other reasons to be lenient. For example, he brings down the Machzor Vitri or the Talmidim of Rashi. They say that for the Berachot of Birkat HaShachar, Hachamim themselves allowed you to make more Berachot. Again, that goes against the Rambam. It goes against the Beit Yosef. But that's what he's using. He also uses the Bach, tries to say that perhaps the Geonim had a different girsa in the Gemara that had Hanoten La'ef Koach in their girsa. But again, that's also hard because none of the Rishonim mention it, and they don't mention this Beracha. It's a much later Beracha. Or none of the main Rishonim or early Geonim mention this Beracha. So therefore, it's very hard to believe that. So, okay, that's Hanoten La'ef Koach. Again, ask your local Orthodox rabbi if you should make the Beracha or not. Fine. Baruch she'amar v'ishtabach. I don't know. We have a couple more minutes. It's okay, guys? Yeah. Vote?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Baruch she'amar v'ishtabach. So this is a very fascinating concept. I'm working on a little teshuvah on this right now. Everybody knows we recite Psuka de Zimra and we say Baruch she'amar, the Beracha in the beginning, and at the end we do Yishtabach. So if you look at the Gemarot, it's not so clear that there's even a Beracha for it. Right, the Beracha of Baruch She'amar Yishtabach it's not anywhere to be found in the Gemara. For example, this is a source in the Gemara in Shabbat. Amar Rabbi Yossi Halki Migomrei Halel Bechol Yom. He says, Rabbi Yossi said, it should be my portion, like I should get reward that every day I finish the Halel. The Gemara says Halel, you're not allowed to say Halel outside of when Hachamim said you're allowed to say it. So therefore he says, no, I meant Psuke de Zimra. Right, so when Rabbi Yossi is saying, I should get rewarded, Halevai, I should be rewarded because I'm saying the Halel, which means I'm saying Psuke de Zimra every day, which simply means, it sounds like it's not something that everybody would do. It wasn't such a common thing, right? So therefore, how do you have a beracha for it? Let's see. And what is this? It's a whole machloket. What does this mean, Psuke de Zimra? So Rashi says it's the two mizmurim of the Halelukas. And then the Rif says, no, it's Ashrei, all the way to the end of the Tehillim. The Rosh brings down a question from Rav Amram Gaon. You come late to Beit Knesset. What do? So he says, the main thing you should do, what do you have to skip? What should you skip? He says, skip everything except Asher Yoshvei Betecha. Why? Because the whole Psuka de Zimra it evolved from the fact that the Gemara says, Kol ha'omer tehillah leDavid bechol yom muftach lo shehu ben ha'olam haba. Anybody who says Ashrei every day, Sometimes there's other girsah that says pamayim, you say twice a day. Forgot the exact girsah. But anybody who says ashrei every day, they get to share in the next world. And because he says ve'agav oto mizmor, this is what Rav Amram Gaon saying. Since based off of that of this ma'amar of Chazal, therefore they established to say Tehillim, to finish the whole Tehillim, and also to make the Berakhot of Baruch She'amar Mishtabach. The Rambam, if you look at the Rambam, it's very weird lashon as well. V'shivchu hachamim lemí shekoreh zimirot misefer Tehillim bechol yom v'yom mitila David ad sof hasefer. He says the hachamim praised those who read Tehillim every day, which is what we saw above in the Gemara, that Rabbi Yossi says it should be my portion in the Olam Haba. So again, it sounds like it's just like a nice midat hasidut to do Tehillim every day, to say this Hallel, which is the Psukkah de Zimra, right? And then he said, though, Tiknu hachamim beracha lifnei azmirot uberacha le'acharei, right? And he said, the Rambam also before that, he says, we added certain, already kavar nahagu likrot pesukim lifneim ul'achareim. We added certain, or there's a custom to add other psukim before and after, which we all do nowadays if you open up any sidur. And then he says that the hachamim established the beracha before and afterwards. So if you open up Rav Sadia Gaon in his sidur, he brings down Katav hitnadeva umnatenu likro mizmorim misefer tishbachot hakedosh baruch. Oh, misefer tishbachot hakadosh baruch Hu. I'm not sure if I copied and pasted right. Ulifnehem achrim shtei berachot. So he's saying kevar hitnadeva. He's saying we not forcefully or not obligatedly say these things. Rather, we gifted ourselves. I forgot, dedicated. There's probably a better word. I just can't think of it right now. We dedicated ourselves to say these things and to recite these berachot. So from Rav Sadia Gaon, sounds like again it was just a minhag to say Baruch She'amar. It was a later post-Talmudic beracha. The Or Zarua as well. Oh, the Or Zarua, it gets on a more Kabbalistic interpretation, is that that the Pitka Nafal Min Shamayim. This is very famous. It says no, there was a certain letter that fell from Shamayim, a script that fell from Shamayim, and it had the words of Baruch She'amar, the actual nosach, the beracha Baruch She'amar, and it had 87 words exactly, and therefore you're not allowed to change it, right? And this is what most of the modern sidurim of the Edut HaMizrach, they have the 87 word Baruch She'amar, they don't change it. However, the question with this is that all the early Rishonim and Geonim, they don't have 87 words in the Baruch She'amar. You open up the Rambam, he has a different one. You open up the old Moroccan Sidurim, they have special things you would add for Shabbat and Yom Tov and different things. They didn't have that same nusach. So again, the big problem too is that it's not mentioned anywhere in Shas, the Baruch She'amar and Yishtabach. And the Pri Hadash, he says like this: Right, the Pri Hadash, he's also shocked. How can, after the sealing of the Gemara, the Geonim enacted Baruch She'amar, these new Berachot, right? And he's shocked by the Rosh, who had a problem with the Beracha, the Pidyon Haben that we mentioned. But again, we saw the Yam Shel Shlomo also had a problem that he had the whole Beracha for the Bitulim. So it's very confusing what's going on here. The Talmidim of Rabbeinu Yonah as well, we don't have time for this, but they also hold that it was a takana of the Geonim that came later on. So again, I don't really have an answer for Harambam, how he would defend this, because the Rambam seemingly, like we saw in the first halacha in Kirat Shema, Berachot of Kirat Shema, he held that you're not allowed to add or remove any Berachot. So we have two questions on really Rambam. Birkat Shabbat, Lalik Ner Shel Shabbat, how did he allow that to be said? And number two, Baruch She'amar Yishtabach. There could be others I'm just not familiar with. If anybody wants to send me them, that'd be great. But these are two strong Berachot that are seemingly post-Talmudic, and nevertheless the Rambam does codify them. And just to make it a little further, I found in Rabbeinu Avram ben Aramam, he has a Teshuvah, and he talks about certain Berachot as well, and he says, any Beracha that is not, he says like this, these Berachot were not mentioned in the Talmud, and even though it's mentioned in Sidurim of the Geonim, of Amram Gaon, etc., it's a mistake of the Sofer, the guy who wrote the Sidur, or Chacham, or the wise person himself, the Torah scholar, or Chazan, ve'asur le'amra. It's forbidden to say these berachot. Ve'lo kayutzi ba mima shenithadesh nosaf berachot. He's saying we can't add more berachot, and it's forbidden to say these berachot. So you see clearly, of course, we know the Rabbeinu Avram ben Rambam, 90% of the time, it could be 95, 98% of the time, he went with the shita of his father, which is very similar. The Rashi as well. A lot of the Moroccans, we say every night, or some say only on Motzei Shabbat, Yiru Enenu. There's a whole thing that you add at the end, right before the Arvit of Shabbat, of Motzei Shabbat, or the Arvit of every night. I think Ashkenazim say it also, no? It says the Yiru Enenu. So the Rashi himself, he writes, he says, he brings the Rash, that Vira Enenu Asul Leomra. You're not allowed to say it. Kol Iker Leomra Kol Ikar. You can't say it at all. Since it's not mentioned in the Talmud, it's a beracha levatala. Although Tosafot have a whole thing why you could say it, and it's Geula Richtahi. Everybody knows that famous Tosafot in the beginning of Berakhot. Nevertheless, Rashi is saying you're not allowed to say it. The Meiri has a whole pshat of why perhaps that the Geonim can add Berakhot. But we're not going to get into that right now. Even though he seemingly holds like not like that. So it's not so clear why we have certain berachot. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Yeah, it's not so pashut why these berachot are in the Rambam, and of course we have many stirot that we need to work on. I'm not here to give you solutions. I saw some solution, for example, the stirot in, for example, Maran himself. He says you make the beracha in birkat betulim, but then regarding hanoten la'ef koach, he says not to say that beracha. So how do you answer these? The Rosh himself, he said you don't do the beracha for the pidyon ben. At the same time, he does say to do the birkat of betulim. There's certain there's a lot, some achronim they try to answer it up. They're very hard to answer these different stirot. Hamuvadi himself, how does he answer? How do you say hanoten la'ef koach? The minhag, like I mentioned, it's circular reasoning. The only thing for the Rambam, just thinking out loud with you guys, is that the Sidurim, like the Rashba mentioned that we don't really have so much in Shas itself, the Talmud, of what the Sidur and what the Nusach is. However, perhaps it really was in the Sidur, and it was the official Nusach. We just kind of, it got lost. It got lost in transmission, and therefore some Geonim had these Berachot, other Geonim didn't have these Berachot, and the Rambam believed that Pashut, and that's why I mentioned at the end of that, the Beracha, the Rambam for Ner Shabbat, he writes down that you have to make the Beracha for Shabbat, just like you have to do for any mitzvah de Rabbanan. So perhaps, the Rambam held for sure that this must be in the original takanot of the Anshe Knesset the Gedolah. But regarding the other Berachot of Maran, I don't have a good answer for that. Hazaku Baruch, guys. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Chacham. That was amazing. We'll open the floor to some questions, comments. If you have anything, you can raise your hand or unmute yourself.
I think I'm doing bad. Both shurim, no questions after.
I'll actually start. Why can't we say that Rambam, when he says that he's talking about the words themselves of the beracha, not about how many berachot you can add after. But and it makes sense in the halacha itself. He's talking about ending, like the way you end the beracha, the wording, not more berachot. And that would solve all our problems.
That definitely would solve a lot of problems. The problem is that it's true. That paragraph, you're in Hilchot Kriyat Shema, right? Ve'en adam rashai lifchot mehem ve'lo leosif alehem. If you just read it without the second part, it sounds like it's going off of all the berachot. All the berachot that Ezra and the Beit Din enacted, you can't add or delete from them. Makom shitnu, but you're right. But then the Sefer he explains it. Makom shitnu. So you're right. If the way I was saying, it should have been a little better to write v'makom shitkinu, like a different vav, add a vav there. I hear what you're saying, and that's definitely a good reading. I also was thinking like that too before I was saying this, but I saw a lot of Achronim that they're learning that no, he's talking about adding or deleting. And on top of it, I saw Rabbeinu, you saw the Yamshel Shlomo, but again, you can't, that's different post scheme. But Rabbeinu Avraham ben Aram, and that's why I brought that at the end, that I found clear. There's another place I found that somebody wanted to make, they asked Rabbeinu Avraham ben Aram about making a beracha at nighttime for Kiryat Shema Alamita, but of course we do make the beracha, but another type of beracha, and he said we're not allowed to add after post-Talmudic berachot. So the shit that the Rabbeinu Avraham ben Rambam, I'm trying to shtim that into the Rambam as well. I saw that's a good way to learn it, but a lot of Achronim I saw, they're not learning it like that. They're learning that you can't add or delete from them. But you're right. That's a good point. Good point.
And it would fit in with his words on the Birkat Betulah, because the only reason why he says that it's a problem is because it's disgusting. not because it's post Talmudic.
Oh, very good. You listen well. There's actually two different girsaot in that beracha. In that teshuvah. In the teshuvah, there's another nusach that makes it look like let me see if I can. Where was it again? Perador. Yeah. Oh, so there's another nusach in the teshuvah of the Rambam. He says, "Harehi beracha levatala b'li safek ve'od hu davar meguneh." They add in like they add another lashon there to make it two separate things. So the other gear side's more clear. It's or the way at least I was saying is that it's a beracha levatala for sure. And then why? First of all, it's a beracha levatala because it's not from the Geonim or not from the Talmud. And then it's also davar meguneh. He's just adding that as well. But I hear the way your diuk is very nice. You learned in a good yeshiva, I could tell. We went to the same yeshiva. Yeah.
I think we have some questions in the chat.
Okay. Okay, which one? We're all the way from the beginning. Where can I find this? Thank you, Sina. What was said to Pilot? Yes, Rav Amram Gaon, Rav Sadi Gaon, they wrote Sidurim. You're right. The communities. It's just Rav Amram Gaon Sidur is more. What I heard is that's closer. The Ashkenazi Sidur is closer to Rav Amram Gaon Sidur. Chabad say Ner Shel Shabbat Kodesh. Interesting. So that's okay. They have the Rashba to rely on to change a little bit of the Nusach, and of course not according to Rambam. What's the connection between candles and Shalom Bayit? Simply that if you have light, you're gonna enjoy your food. You're not gonna get into a fight. You're not gonna, get lost in your way. More to discuss about that. Where we say the saying. Oh, any other examples where we have a mitzvah de rabbanan where we say that saying the beracha is only a minhag? Any other examples? There is a whole machloket about building a ma'akeh around your house. Did you make a beracha on that or not? That is a halacha. And the beracha itself, I forgot. I think the Rambam does not bring it down, or the Shulchan Aruch does bring it down. I have to look into that. But just I have to. It's a good question. Anybody can chime in if they want and they know stuff.
I'm primarily asking the question because Rav Adi doesn't like making brachot on minhagim. And he was saying, well, it's not minhag, it's a halakha, but the bracha is a minhag. I'm trying to kind of understand the difference in my mind, and I'm struggling. That's why he doesn't make the bracha. He says you shouldn't make the bracha on halal because it's a minhag. But we're saying there is a chiyuv of doing whatever the action is, but actually the bracha is only a minhag, and I can think of no other examples where we say we have a minhag of making a bracha, but perhaps there are others.
Right. I mean, their Chanukah in the Beit Knesset, that's a minhag as well, and they make a beracha. Even. Yeah,
but the action's a minhag.
The action is
here we're saying the action is a chiyuv, but the bracha is a minhag, so it's not the same thing.
You're saying only when there's a chiyuv. Okay, Sarihun, good questions. Spanish Portuguese do not say anoten koach. Okay, good to know. Okay. Were Maran and Ari contemporary in Sfat? Yes, they were. Oh yeah, okay, you guys are answering that. That seems still very Baruch Shemar and Shabbat and Yom Barach. Okay, beautiful. The Gra posed it, so Ashkenazim Israel who follow don't say right exactly. The Gaon de Vilna as well did not say Hanoten La'ef Koach. How could people say such things about following Arizal Psak because he had Ruach HaKodesh when Hazal are so clear about Lo B'Shamayim Hi and the status of Nevuah? Right. So that's a good question. Rav Yaakov Hillel has a whole thing about why we don't say Lo B'Shamayim Hi Neged de Arizal. If you want, I wrote a teshuvah on this, trying to argue with Rav Yaakov Hillel on this. But they pretty much, their claim is that since Eliyahu, it's Gilu Eliyahu is different than Lo B'Shamayim Hi. Right? When Eliyahu comes and tells you something, that is not Lo B'Shamayim Hi anymore, because you have a physical person telling you something. But the question with that is that Eliyahu got it from Shamayim. So therefore, it's kind of, again, circular reasoning. So, but that's, they have a whole limud on this, that Arizal is Lo B'Shamayim because it's Gilu Eliyahu, and they make a chiluk between Gilu Eliyahu and a bat kol. Bat kol is very, from the Gemara, it's talking about a bat kol, this heavenly voice that comes from somewhere. Mashinkin, here, Gilu Eliyahu is different. But again, I don't really follow that either. Isn't it said that every mitzvah has a beracha? What does this mean if practice of Rabbanim do not probably give a beracha for a mitzvah? Right. That's probably that's what you're saying is probably the shita of the Rambam, is that's why the Rambam felt perhaps to make the beracha ner Shabbat, because since the mitzvah, of course, you have so much content on it in the Gemara and Shabbat, so for sure there would be a beracha for it, and perhaps that would follow anywhere. But I don't know any other sources off the top of my head where the Rambam would hold not to make a beracha. It's a good question. Sarichiyu. Again, this is just to.
But surely we have many cases where we don't make a bracha, like giving tzedakah. We don't make a bracha on giving tzedakah. There are many mitzvot.
Right.
It's not the case that 100% of mitzvot have a bracha.
Right, but you're like chiyuvim that should have a beracha. Like you would think, why not make a beracha? Why would Chazal not make a beracha for Ner Shabbat? Right? Why not? For tzedakah, there's all these reasons all the poskim give, and before you do kibud aveim, the other poskim, the Rashba, everybody deals with these. Why we don't make berachot for that? So I guess the question is that do we have to just find it somewhere in Shas, the mention of this beracha, and then we could say it, or is it no? We have certain reasoning, and then now we apply, we ourselves, the poskim, the Rishonim, the Rambam itself, he applies these these reasonings, and he tells us when to make the beracha or not, and pashut that there would be a beracha for something like Ner Shabbat. I mean, you have to say that because Rav Kafech, imagine, he was the biggest Talmid Mufak of the Rambam. He dedicated his whole life to Rambam. He wrote the biggest perush on the Rambam, more than anybody that ever written, and he still nevertheless says that the beracha for Shabbat was a geonic takana. So he's seemingly arguing with what the Rambam is saying, but unless we learn that somehow we have to learn the Rambam differently, we have to take maybe Oad's diuk in the Rambam, and that maybe the Rambam would be okay with post Talmudic berachot. He just didn't like that beracha of the bitulim, because that sounds it's disgusting, and we don't really want to praise the bitulim or the concept of you got a virgin. So this is again food for thought, and we just tipped this is just information that I've collected over the years and just brought it into a source page for you guys. But again, it's the Yam Shel Torah. It's just at the tip of it. Right, other berachot of the Geonim are invalid. Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, again, we have to say that the Rambam perhaps felt that it could be a mitzvah a beracha that was instituted by the Hachamim. It's just the Gemara didn't talk about it, but it's still there. Yeah, it goes back to what I said, that the Rambam, he felt that there is one correct nosach of the Sidur, and we have to try our best to find that one nosach. Whereas the Mikubalim, they changed the nosach. The Arizal changed many different things in the nosach of the Tefillah, whereas the Rambam held, there's one, there's other approach that has each shevet had their own Tefillah, but that's hard really. I think the Khatam Sofer has a whole thing on that, saying it's hard to really to understand that, because we have Kohanim, we have Levim nowadays, and they're they don't have a different nosach. What happened with that? But yeah, Sarichion.
Okay.
Whether or not it was a bracha over something that Hazal had decreed or not. Can you expand upon that? Sorry. Oh, you're talking about Isaac. Oh, not Isaac. Oh, yeah. Isaac also. Sorry. Mechila.
Okay.
Alrighty, guys.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you so much, Chacham. It was an incredible shiur. We're excited to have you many more times with us. And I'm sure the discussion will continue, and everyone can also continue the discussion on our Discord. The Chacham is on there, so you can have direct contact with him. And Laila Tov, everyone. Thank you so much. Have a good one.